This week on the Honor Roll podcast, we'll be talking to the Right Honorable Henry McLeish, visiting professor of professional practice at USF and former First Minister of Scotland. We'll be discussing his time in politics and his experiences in government as well as a lecturer. Coming up next. Hey Honors Bulls, welcome to the Honor Roll podcast, the flagship podcast of the Judy Genshaft Honors College podcast network. I'm your host, Fabiana Requena, a third-year student studying marketing and business analytics at the University of South Florida and a proud member of the Honors College. Today, my co-host is Reva Gandhi, a third-year student studying biomedical sciences and public health with a minor in nutrition. Welcome, Reva, to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey, Fabi, it's so great to be here. I am very excited to hear about everything that we're going to be talking about today.
Yes, and as always, we like to start off the podcast with one big question. So my question today is a little bit controversial, but do you call it football or soccer?
Okay, so don't come at me, but growing up in the Midwest, I have always called it soccer.
Mm-hmm.
I can't get into the habit of calling it football, no matter how many of my friends might try to convince me.
I would say for me, because at home we call it football in Spanish, so that's always been my term for it. But honestly, I use soccer in a day-to-day as to not get confused with American football.
Yeah, well, going to the UK, it definitely changes your attitude and perspective on things. Well, today we'll be joined by the Right Honorable Henry McLeish, a former footballer turned politician who has written many books from Scotland to American-European relations. He will be chatting with us about his time working in politics and his work here at USF. Stay tuned.
Hi everybody, my name is Bethany Jowers. I'm one of the graduate assistants that works here in the Honors College, and I'd like to invite you to participate in the Grand Challenge 2024 Investigation for Action. So for the Grand Challenge, you're going to submit a research poster investigating a barrier faced by somebody in the disability community and propose a solution that incorporates one of the UN SDGs. The deadline for this project is going to be on midnight, November 11th, and you can visit the Honors website if you need any more information.
Today we are here with the Right Honorable Henry McLeish, a USF Honors visiting professor of professional practice and, no big deal, former First Minister of Scotland. In addition to his USF appointment, he was an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh, a member of the King's Privy Council, and a regular contributor to public discussions in the UK through print, radio, television, and online media. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. McLeish. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much. Delighted to be here and in Florida at the university. I've been a politician most of my life. I think I've spent 50 years in public service, 30 years in elected service, and clearly have a lot to say about what's happening in the world today. But the important thing is that we always have to be optimistic in life and look forward, and hopefully that podcast will be a contribution to that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, Mr. McLeish, your career path is fascinating, but something people might not know about you is that in your early career, you were actually a professional football player. What kind of drew you from football into politics?
Well, I think for the first few years of my life, really from the age of 2 till about 15, I did nothing but play soccer, just to differentiate it from the American game. So I loved soccer, played at virtually every level, at school level. And when I was 15, I signed for an English second division team called Leeds United. Couldn't settle down, came back to Scotland and played there for about 6 or 7 years in Scotland. And it was at that point, though, I realised that I would have to do something with my life apart from soccer. So I had to go back to school. I had left school, go back to school, get the necessary hires and ordinaries, their certificates, to take me to university. So that was the early part of my career. But of course, I wasn't long after leaving school that I got involved in politics, and I was first elected to one of the councils when I was 23. So I've been in politics for a very, very long time.
Can you tell us what a First Minister actually does for those in the audience who aren't really aware, and what your day-to-day looked like in office, how you kind of ended up there?
The Scottish Parliament was created by the government of the United Kingdom in 1997 under Tony Blair. So I returned to Scotland to sit in that first Parliament, and in 2001 became First Minister. Very exacting job. It's a job that's 24 hours. It's a job in which you're not only leader of the government, but also a constituency member of Parliament. That's your political district in America. And so you have a lot of work to do. So incredibly pressurised, incredibly complex at times, but very rewarding. And I think this is the key theme for young people looking at a career in politics. It was all about public service. No matter what you're doing in government, at whatever level you operate, it should be about public service. And to me, there was nothing more rewarding than having a life where I could serve people, get the satisfaction out of that, and know that you're doing something not only just for the people, but for your community. And hopefully, at the highest level of politics, you're doing something towards the environment.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the political scene looked like in Scotland at the time that you served?
Well, in 1997, the Labour government had just been elected at Westminster, and it was a kind of landslide victory for Tony Blair's government. But one of the main commitments we had promised was to have a Scottish Parliament, a Welsh Assembly, and a Northern Ireland Assembly. So this was put into practice. So the politics were pretty positive at that point. In 1997, and of course the Scottish Parliament was opened in 1999. So we had wasted no time in getting the legislation through and then getting the Parliament up and running. And so this is the 25th anniversary this year of the opening of the Scottish Parliament. And I look back with some pride on what we had created. But the great thing in politics is politics never stops. And so therefore the last 25 years is behind you, but the next 25 years is what you're doing at the present time. So you always have an eye to the past, but more importantly, an eye to the future.
Yeah, so in creating that, what were some of the challenges you faced?
Well, I think in 99, when the Parliament opened, there was a great deal of unity of purpose, that this was a new venture for Scotland, because Scotland had been part of England and part of Wales and Northern Ireland since 1707. And so for 300 years, we had no Parliament in Scotland. So this was the start of a great adventure, which I was part of. And of course, all my colleagues were, in fact, part of it as well. But the challenges we faced were getting the Parliament established. This is a new institution, new people, new psychology, new philosophy, new objectives. And so therefore, it was a matter of trying to get unity within the political parties, and that served us really well.
Can you pinpoint an exact moment or a valuable experience during the time that you served that you kind of take with you in your future years?
Well, I think, as I said, I've been elected for 30 years in the past, and I spent 15 years at Westminster, the House of Commons in London. But I think in Scotland, I've always been interested in care, in social services and health. So I was instrumental in putting through a piece of legislation which was about personal care. And at that time, you paid for personal care in Scotland. But when I took over, I was determined that we'd have free personal care at the point of need in Scotland. So that was I look back on as one of my greatest achievements. But as I said, I think it's important that no matter what you do in politics, you just have this regard for the idea of public service. And I picked that up from my grandparents, because my mother and father were quite political in their ways. But my grandfather was, like me, a football player. He played for the same team as I did. He was a mine worker, a coal miner. He worked to the point, come the First World War. He was then serving in the First World War, came back, shattered, became an alcoholic, and then he became an evangelical Christian. So in a sense, what he had was a socialism and a Christianity, a lot of which rubbed off on me. And I also had a grandmother who was a fearsome socialist and a fierce politician in her own right. So from their talks and from their understanding, I became very interested in the idea of public service. So that was the roots of my public service, and that stood me quite well as I progressed through political life.
So now you came from a really strong background and you kind of forged your own path. What is your biggest critique of the political climate, both in the UK, in Scotland, and even in the US today?
Well, there's a subject for you. Let me say that if you look around the world, we are not in good shape. There are wars, there are famine, there's poverty, there's outrageous tyrannies being exercised against people. And at the same time, we're really not looking upon the big issues like climate change, energy depletion, use of coal, strategic nuclear weapons are still available. So there's two strands. One is the immediate problems facing the planet, but secondly, the problems that we're not giving enough time to. But of course, one big issue, which is complex, is this question of democracy. This is the idea that came from the Greeks, demos kratos, power of the people. And my contention is that that is being abused in many countries in the world. We have countries which are authoritarian, like China, like Russia, but we also have democracies which are under a bit of strain, including, I think, the United States. And the United States globally now is regarded as a decaying democracy in the sense that you suppressing people in terms of voting. We have a situation where you have a presidential campaign taking place, and some of the comments that are being made, some of the attacks on people are really not acceptable in any sense of a modern world. It gets complicated in terms of what that means. But what it does mean is that in America, you cherish freedom. But what one party is offering is not freedom. It's basically saying, you can do what you want as long as I agree to it. And that, for me, is not an interpretation of freedom. So politics has changed dramatically. The outcomes have changed dramatically. And I think there is a real danger if we don't watch through being complacent, democracy will start to be undermined as well, as it has done in other countries, and which I fear is happening in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Based on those critiques, what are some possible solutions that you would like to see implemented? Like, what do you think would aid us during these times?
Well, I think that's a great question because I think we're in dark times in the world and in America. You're heading towards an election where 50% of the population, or the voting population, will vote for someone and 50% for the other one. You are a bitterly divided country. And it seems to me we have to get to the root of what that division actually means. So for me, it's complicated. Americans have a very complicated society, very divided society, and there's a lot of history, a lot of past around. But we have a situation now where a lot of political comment is aimed at dividing the population. So what we must do, and I think this is for your generation in particular, is to look at how we can rebuild some trust in each other. So instead of fighting each other, looking for scapegoats, we're actually looking for a unity of purpose. And to me, that means that you look at the role of a citizen. I mean, you're both citizens. I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom. What does that mean? It's a citizen of your country. But one idea that I have and have seen developed is become a citizen of humanity. So you're not just a citizen for your own interests. You're a citizen for fellow Americans. You're a citizen for the fellow people in the world. And that seems to me a great point. But the other point, of course, is that do we have any obligations to each other? Are we just individuals living in a world where we just project what we want rather than be sympathetic to what others want? And in that sense, there's some good books about what we call obligations, that sitting here talking to the two of you, we should have obligations to each other. We should want to be patriotic, not nationalistic. We want to be understanding, not threatening. We want to see people in discussions use the truth. Because one of the great tragedies about America is your politics is riddled again with absolute lies that can only help dissent, not bring unity of purpose. So I think there is a way forward. And for me, the important point is that it won't be my generation that will have to embark upon that challenge. It is yourselves, that age group. And you can do it. And people can say often, what can I do? I'm only one person. But one person can become two, and two can become a group, and a group can have a purpose, and a purpose could become something else. So I'm optimistic that this is a trough that the world is going through, and I'd like to think that we can emerge from that. But it will require a key consideration. Do not take democracy lightly. It's under threat, and if we don't watch, it could have really serious consequences for not only us, but everyone on the planet.
I think having conversations like this, where we have two people from one generation and somebody else from another generation, can really teach us a lot, especially about the history in our past and what things to avoid. And you mentioned how our generation is really going to have to be the one to do a lot of the fixing. What would you say to people like us, younger students, about getting involved in politics?
Well, I think there are two things. I mean, one, I imagine few of you will get involved in politics in the sense of being elected.
Right, yes.
On the other hand, you will be involved in issues. For example, sensitive subject, but it's worth raising. Abortion is a huge issue in America. Now, to me, the concept of freedom means that a woman should have control over her reproductive rights. But currently at federal level, she doesn't. And you've got a situation now where 15 states out of the 50 have banned abortion full stop. And another 4 or 5 have a 6 weeks. Now, when you step back and think about it, why should a government be involved in your reproductive rights? Surely the ultimate freedom is within reason for you to do what you wish. So I think at your generation, of course, there's the complex issue of gender as well. So in your position, you can look at what's happening just now, which I think is worldwide a very scary political environment. And you could first of all decide, yes, I want to be active in politics. That's one step. But the other consideration is just to be a thinking, caring, thoughtful citizen. So whether you're working in pharmaceuticals or you're working in engineering or whatever, you can make your role by being tolerant, by being truthful, being observant. I mean, it sounds highly simplistic, but in a sense, if you look at the problems of America just now, politically, these are the qualities that you're lacking. And if you can bring those to bear on the future consideration of issues, then that would be a huge step forward. And I think for me that the word is tolerance. You know, you shouldn't have a country in which if you're pro-abortion and anti-abortion, you criticize, you assault, you attack, you demean, you hate each other. Now, for a so-called civilized community like America, that seems to me quite ridiculous. And if you take some of the other issues, in the past we had a position where if you had a different view, it would be tolerated. That's no longer the case. And the other point is, in the past, people were often looking for respect, whether it be Native Americans or whatever. But now you've got groups that want superiority. And if you have superiority in politics, you create division. And it was Abraham Lincoln who said that a house divided cannot stand. So from my perspective, America today is a house divided. And it's really important to wonder why it can survive in its form unless there are major changes taking place. So a bit of philosophy, a bit of history, and from my early days with my grandparents, my grandfather in particular, nobody should need to look at the Bible and believe every word or want to believe that everything it's said in terms of stories is true. But as a precursor to obligations to each other, then the 10 Commandments, for example, have a lot of resonance. You don't have to be a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew to think there's a lot of wisdom, and also in the Quran. But we just have to become tolerant. And my great fear is, and your generation has to fix this, we are fast moving to becoming so intolerant. That's when we start the divisions.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's like a fine line between advocacy and standing up for what you believe in and not respecting alternate opinions in that matter. And I think that line has become blurred over the years to where we can no longer sit in a room and have a conversation. And I think the Honors College does a really good job of trying to bring back that sort of conversation.
Absolutely. We have plenty of classes that we can talk about, like civic issues. And in my opinion and in my experience, it has all been very tame. There's not been any issues with it, and people are allowed to have different opinions.
No, and even beyond our classes, just our events. I mean,
Right.
We can go in and talk to our faculty or professors anytime, and they're always willing to share their opinion and listen to us. And I think that speaks a lot to our global citizenship and engagement that we have.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, because that's the atmosphere of the Honors College, and it revolves around words like respect. I may not agree with what you say, but I respect the right for you to say it, and we don't have to go to war about it. And it's all about tolerance. But the great issue, looking back to great authors like George Orwell, he was someone who valued truth. And it seems a simple point, but you cannot build a world on lies, because if you do, no one understands what's a lie, what's the truth. So there's some great messages from the past, but the great issue for me is you have the capacity, you have the energy, you have the enthusiasm, and you have the understanding to know that if we carry on the path that we are, then your lives will be diminished as a consequence, because you'll be looking over your shoulder. You know, and it will never be a civil war in America. That's ridiculous. But a political civil war is actually happening now, so much so that this election that's coming on November the 5th will be decided with a few thousand votes out of a population of 330 million. That seems to me like division.
And when you put that in perspective, a few thousand is not a lot of people.
Yeah.
And one of the other issues that your generation, I think, should tackle, for example, out of a population of the 330 million, only 2/3 vote. So a third of Americans sit at home, where important decisions are being made about their futures. If you compare this with the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, they're maybe up 70-80% of people vote, not 60%. The UK is even better, up to 70%. And so therefore one of the things you've got to rekindle an interest in democracy itself, because without votes, democracy withers. And currently we're at a point where if more people voted, it would give you a better idea of what Americans actually thought.
Do you think that decreased voting rate is a cause of lack of education here?
Well, that becomes quite a sensitive subject, because there's a lot of books that discuss the question of poor education, or they use the word ignorance. I think ignorance is the wrong word to lose. But there is no doubt that education is the key, because education is the key not to have one decision or another, but to be understanding, to know there are differences. And so therefore we can start not teaching. You don't teach kids of 7 and 8-year-old about politics, about life. But what you can do is have what we call in the UK modern studies. You can also look at religion objectively, because some of the worst excesses in the world are caused by religion. On the other hand, some of the best parts of society are religious as well. So if we get to young people in schools, that's where to start. And what you do is you build and build and build. Because for me, democracy is hard work. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people, like the Republican presidential candidate, they can have divisions in society, because we as Democrats, and think, including me, we've been complacent. We thought everything was fine. Just carry on. Democracy will just evolve and evolve and evolve. And like the Greeks, the power of the people will always be there. Well, the power of people will always be there, but in what form? So my concern about the presidential candidate for the Republican Party is that he's creating divisions. His main purpose is to divide America, hoping that there's enough on the Republican side to win the occupancy of the White House. Now, that's not the way politics should be conducted. And if we start with young people, give them that vision of a different future. And can I also make the point that I'm always intrigued in America about freedom, liberty, land of the free and the brave. You're no longer that. The Statue of Liberty exists in New York as a symbol of how people were drawn to America to take part in this city on the hill. But thinking back now to what that was, there's a different symbol today where America looks divided and intolerant. And that's not what a great country like yours should be.
And I think that also goes to ask the question of freedom for all, because really, even at the foundation of our country, that was not true for all people.
Well, I mean, the foundation, the founding fathers created, in terms of your US Constitution, a magnificent document which has served you well. But even at that early point, in terms of voting, it was only white, wealthy, landowning men that had a vote. Okay. People of colour and women got votes later. So the struggle throughout politics has always been to give to those who did not have the rights that other people share. And that's been the great benefit of America, land of the free. But liberty and freedom have been made so much of that I think America's forgotten actually what that means. So in terms of issue we talked about, abortion, in terms about race, there are many divisive issues that need harmony, not further division. So, I have been coming to America now for over 150 times. I love the country. It's a beautiful country. It's like 50 different countries. But at the end of the day, I've seen it slip and slip and slip to me. So my worry as I look forward is that you have to heal the divisions. Because if you don't, there'll be major problems. And let's acknowledge, like the UK and other countries, some other countries in Europe, you have massive inequality. And it seems to me that in terms of freedom, you cannot have freedom unless it's freedom for everyone. And you cannot have freedom if you have massive inequalities that prevent people from exercising that freedom.
Right, and I think that shifts the topic a little bit into modern day politics, as we've been discussing, but with the increase of social media and new marketing campaigns, it's hard for young voters, older voters to kind of differentiate, what's true, what's false. And now the entire world, it's no longer like a secluded nation that's voting on a presidential campaign or anything really. The entire world's kind of weighing in on the politics, and it becomes a global affair.
It seems elementary to me that you are submerged, America, now in lies after lies after lies after lies. It's very, very difficult to find the truth. And in being critical of that fact, it is the Republican presidential candidate, Mr. Trump, that is creating most of the mischief in this area. And as I said previously, you cannot have a politics without truth being a key ingredient. So if that is the case and people like myself and yourselves respect truth, why are so many people just ignoring his lies? And that's one of the great issues that we've got to tackle. Is it because he's become a cult figure, attracting people that may dislike him, but may actually think the things he says they support? So there's complex issues around that, which America itself has got to deal with. But I do think that in terms of the society that you live in, I'm British and I'm looking in on America and I love the country. But I'm perplexed and really worried about the direction it's taking. And I come back to this point that I never realised. I always joke with people and say it's taken me about 40 years to start to understand America. But you're a complex country. But nevertheless, if you throw away truth, if you throw away honesty, if you pack your elections out with lies, then they're falling on ears which are listening and believing possibly. And that's the danger that you've got to escape from. So politics is a huge subject in many ways, but it needs foundations. And currently the foundations are crumbling. And if they continue to crumble, you keep coming back to Lincoln about that house and that divide, and it cannot stand. It sounds simplistic, but it's often better to talk in these terms to try and get to impact a wider audience.
Are you interested in graduate study, prestigious scholarships, studying abroad? Serving all 3 USF campuses, the Office of National Scholars, ONS, mentors USF students for prestigious awards and scholarship programs focused on research, international education, graduate study, and intellectual development. If you're interested in applying for awards like Fulbright, Rhodes, or Marshall, don't wait. Meet with an ONS advisor to discover what's possible. You can visit the ONS website or drop by their office on the second floor of the Judy Genshaft Honors College building to learn more.
Obviously, the Republican Party has gone under some changes over the past few decades, and in today's political world here in America, we have the Republican Party that is essentially owned by Trump, right? It's been taken over. What would you say to that now a political party has kind of followed under his lead rather than kind of the overarching, I would say, fundamentals and principles of the Republican Party before that?
Well, this is the major challenge for the Republican Party, known in America as the Grand Old Party, with a formidable reputation, done enormous things for America, and quite rightly a Grand Old Party. But the trouble is it's been taken over. It's now a permanent fixture in terms of MAGA, Make America Great Again. A ludicrous concept in so many ways, because America is the most significant country in the world. But how you MAGA it to make it better seems ridiculous. But you then come to this question of one person, supported financially, though, by a huge number of billionaires, like people like Elon Musk. Classic example of exercising power without any responsibility. And looks to me deeply embarrassed every time he appears on a stage with Mr. Trump. But that's his problem, not ours. But you then get back to this question of one person becoming a cult figure. And these MAGA rallies that I've looked at intensely are like bread and circuses, you know. Keep the people happy while sinister things are going to be happening if I'm elected. And one of the important points, I think, here is that Donald Trump has got 3 campaigns. Kamala Harris has only got 1 campaign. She wants to win. Trump has 3 campaigns. One campaign is to rig the election beforehand. This is voter suppression. Secondly, is to try and win the election. And thirdly, as he did in January 6th, create chaos and not accept the result. Now, interestingly, we used to criticise African countries because the great weakness was they would not have a peaceful handover of power. You didn't have a peaceful handover of power in 25 in January. You're not going to have a peaceful transfer of power if Trump loses this election. And so for America, you've got to step back and think, wow, we're doing what African countries did in the past and for which we criticised. And now we have a situation where 3 campaigns underway and Mr. Trump is hell-bent on being in the White House, no matter the cost to America's reputation or the cost to the American people. So it sounds really sobering, but it is. And that's my fear, that people don't see the long-term consequences of this and just think it may be a small, exit from what we normally do. It's not. It's serious business. And again, that's why your generation, who in terms of education, in terms of academic involvement, in terms of looking at life, you can actually decide truth is helpful. And even if we're to get that back into the discussion, that would make an enormous difference to where we are. And I really feel strongly about that because, see, in the United Kingdom, whilst we have right and left, as you do here, no one on the right or on the left would say anything like the disgraceful, disgusting and obscene verbiage that a presidential candidate comes out with. That would not just be tolerated. And I don't know whether this will be edited out, but if you call the Vice President and presidential candidate Kamala Harris a that's totally unacceptable. See, politics, comedy, theatre, television, drama, that's not acceptable. And that's where you know that not only are you breaking the rules of political exchange and dialogue, but you're actually demeaning everything that people should be standing for. And so therefore I'm strong on this issue because it's an unforgivable attempt to undermine people when in fact you should be in politics looking at policies, not the people. And what has happened in this country is we've entered the era of revenge politics, where forget about the policies, let's just go for the person. And I can find no words to describe that other than a great tragedy for the United States.
I think that brings up some really great points. And as much as I'd like to talk about politics, I wanted to ask, kind of shift the conversation and ask, how, after leaving office, did you decide the next chapter of your life and what it would look like into writing and becoming a lecturer?
Well, at that point, after being in elected politics for a very long time, there are other opportunities I felt that could be. So I didn't leave with any prescription in mind of what your life should be about, but decided that if you gain experience and gain some knowledge, gain some ideas, then why not try and share them? So I've been able to write 9 books. They won't win Nobel Prizes for literature. They're ideas, but not great literature. I'm working on a book just now with an academic colleague in Edinburgh on 25 years of devolution, which will come out early next year. So that seemed important. I also do some written work for newspapers on articles, and I'm currently doing a series on American politics up until the election in 2 weeks' time. And I've also got involved in other organisations. Because of my mining background, I chair the National Mining Museum of Scotland. I also am an ambassador for Alzheimer's Scotland. Now, that is a fascinating involvement in the sense that it is now the world's biggest killer. And in Scotland, we have about 100,000 people out of our 5.5 million population with Alzheimer's. The issue about Alzheimer's is that with other illnesses and diseases, people die, and that's tragic in itself. But Alzheimer's dementia, you can see people dying in front of you over a long period. Interestingly, there's 2 new drugs that come from America that are slowing up the progression of the illness, the disease, which is really good, but there's no prospect of a cure in sight. So I spend much of my time cajoling government, speaking in public about what we need to be doing. And one of the simple issues, again, it reflects politics, is that a lot of people have to go into care homes, residential facilities when they get to a point. We're now arguing in Scotland that people should stay in their own home for as long as possible because that's the best environment for them. So there's many aspects to it. And I also do some work with what we call the Scottish Football Supporters Association, which I'm on the board of, which takes me back to my old days in politics and in football. So I'm kept busy. And I often think sometimes I might need to retire, but not yet.
Well, so your work with the Alzheimer's Association in Scotland is incredible to me. And it's something that I've kind of secondhandedly witnessed myself from my parents. Their grandparents had Alzheimer's, and they tell me stories about how debilitating it was to be able to go there every weekend. You know, in India with the trains and everything, it's difficult to transport and see them often. But just to go there and as, you know, a granddaughter, for them to not recognize who you are. And I think there's something incredible that we're doing, trying to help people, because it's difficult for not only the individual who's suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, but also, you know, the family and friends that they've left behind, because they don't know that line of, are they going to remember me next time I see them?
Well, this is why you're right to highlight that issue, because this is the dying in front of your eyes bit. Mm-hmm. It could take a very long time, but they'll go through different stages. And it requires a very sensitive, caring family to deal with all of that, because it is difficult. But again, trying to be optimistic, you know, the history of health in the world and health and medicine, a lot of it originated in Scotland. Scotland has a tremendous reputation during the Enlightenment period, 1840 to about 1740 to 1810, where significant things were happening in health. But today, we can look ahead, but we don't see a cure. On the other hand, this development in terms of slowing up the progression of the disease is is important. But it also means that the importance of health cannot be exaggerated. I mean, in my world, I have two issues that shape the world, education and health. And to me, both of these, this is my dream, should be free at the point of need. No one should pay for education. No one should pay for health. Because if you think about it, they're the qualities, they're the issues that make a country successful and resilient, or not successful and not resilient. And so coming back to Alzheimer's, let's give an example of COVID. What happened with COVID was the world came together to get treatment, an antidote. And it did it remarkably quickly. And it spent vast sums of money. Now, I don't think for a minute that pouring money into something like Alzheimer's would make a difference for tomorrow. But, if the world has a will, we can take on these big issues and eventually bring a solution quicker than might be the case. But it's all about priorities. The world is a very rich place, but it's very unevenly distributed throughout. And when we take priorities, it seems to me that in terms of health and education, these are vital and we could be spending more. Because I often hear that, like, for example, America, can't afford this, can't afford that. Well, there may be a limit, but currently there doesn't seem to be with, kind of 30 trillion ceiling on your debt. So if there's a will, I think there can be a way often. And this is one of the messages of politics, that often people say, well, you can't do this. That can't be achieved. Hey, maybe it can. It just needs a different mindset to apply to it.
Along the same lines, through your experience as a political leader and figure, what are some fundamental differences that you have seen between the way that we handle the healthcare in the United States and in Scotland?
Well, there's a controversial issue. Scotland is very much in tune with the United Kingdom. So although we have a Scottish Parliament that's responsible for health in the government, we're very much in the UK. And in 1948, the National Health Service was established in the United Kingdom, which is essentially a service free at the point of need. So I always tell people that when I came out of my mother's womb all those years ago, we only had one piece of bureaucracy. You get a national insurance number. And that's the only paperwork you ever do. So that compares with a massive paperwork industry in terms of your private care. On the other hand, the National Health Service needs a lot of investment, and it grows because of technology, because of innovations, because of new sciences. More people need treatment. So, that can be problematic. So we're experiencing great difficulties in the UK now, adjusting to the modern world in many respects. But where we are putting a lot of thinking into is this question of wellness versus illness. If you think about it, you come into the health service if you're ill or need treatment. But if we had people who were involved in supporting wellness, maybe fewer people would need to go into the illness part of this. So the big debate in the UK is that we should be spending more on wellness, attacking the underlying conditions a lot of people have. And hopefully in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we'll be spending less on illness. And that brings you into terms of, for example, in the UK, we're taking steps to restrict the advertising of certain foods on television at certain times in the evening so that children won't watch them. Now, that would be anathema to America. That would be described as the nanny state. But when you think about it, healthy food makes healthy people. And when you consider, some people think, well, that should be left to the individual. Fine. But in terms of issues like obesity, that then becomes a major health cost. So what we should be trying to do with this advertising is to say that you cannot advertise. And let's be honest, a lot of processed food has no taste. So you have to have fat, sugar to make it presentable and tasteable. So I think that's the next big step for, many issues in health, is to try and move from illness to wellness. And in doing so, we create societies of healthy people who not only live longer, but if you take Alzheimer's, for example, people who have been on a different diet or a healthy diet most of their lives may have less problems. They may still get the disease, but they may be in a better position to deal with it. So that's the debate in the UK. I'm not sure whether that kind of nanny state debate will emerge in America.
I think that brings up an important topic about nutrition. I know a lot of countries in Latin America have introduced these octagonal little shapes on any really like any processed food, and they say like high in sugar, high in saturated fats as kind of like a warning, as that advertisement, like, hey, you can consume this, but make sure that you're not consuming it in excess amounts because it will cause these things. And I think those advertisements are super important, but that's something that I would definitely like to see here in America. I just don't know how receptive Americans would be to it.
No. And I remember when I went to England, they have on our nutrition labels, they have it in green, yellow, orange, and red.
It's like a rating.
And it almost, it's you can't avoid it. So you look at it, you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't eat
Exactly.
that. And I think the biggest cultural shock I had over there was the fact that we didn't have as much options. So we're used to here going to Publix and we have 15 options of salsa. We really do not need 15 options of salsa.
And also having like fruits and vegetables in their like peak seasonal times. Like we have access to all the fruits and vegetables at all times of the year because we make people grow them at all times of the year. Whereas where you go to other countries, you know, there's a time for certain produce.
And a lot of the produce is also local, which I think makes a big difference because it's fresh. It hasn't traveled across.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of these comments are really first class because, you know, eventually it sometimes comes down to the role of the state. And I know in America, you know, a lot of people don't like government, don't like big government. You know, they prefer the states as against the federal government, and there's just they're not valued. But if you look at health, why would you want to keep spending, as we should, millions upon millions and trillions on healthcare? A lot of it is caused by what people do and what their own lifestyles are. Now, there is a debate to be had then. One could say, well, it's up to them. If they want to kill themselves by eating bad food, that's fine. Or on the other hand, you could argue, yeah, but there is a problem with your argument that will cost us then because more illness will cost more in terms of what you as a taxpayer or as an individual will pay. And that's why the wellness issue is slowly developing. It will take years and maybe decades, but you simply cannot get off with the contradictions between feeding people stuff that will actually make them unwell or hold back how well they might be, and at the same time argue these issues on the individual liberty and freedom. It's the freedom to do what? Is it the freedom to become, you know, obese, and then the nation picks up the cost of it? Or is it right to say, well, we can have some restrictions and they will pay dividends? And it's this resilience issue. Resilience is one of the key issues now in the world. It's the ability of countries to bounce back after particular problems. And I just cannot believe that in the US you have excesses that are not necessary and undermine your ability to be classified as one of the healthiest nations in the world. And indeed, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, Holland, they're all well above in any global league table of healthy countries.
Well, yeah, and then I think you run into the problem of accessibility as well with those socioeconomic barriers, where at least, especially I've seen in the U.S., where people who might live in lower income areas don't have access to your normal grocery stores, and they end up shopping at convenience stores, and they just can't afford fresh foods, fresh vegetables, and then they end up going to our healthcare system where they go into more crippling debt, and it kind of turns into this bi-directional relationship where they can't really escape it.
Well, and to me, summing up what you've just said there is that to me is a kind of thinking human being is not acceptable. Full stop. However, you then get into the realms of culture wars, conspiracy theories, different ideas, but basically there is something below the American debate which is saying you're really on your own. You know, why should I pay for you if what you do is your responsibility and it was bad health and whatever? Now, that's an extreme view of what's happening. But on the other hand, free at the point of need does at least identify health as, of all the issues, the key one. You know, often make dead people are no use to the economy. It's a kind of, cynical remark. But to me, we have now got to rethink our health service in the UK, which we are doing. But it doesn't seem like in America you can do that because Big Pharma, as it's called, has a vested interest in making money, which in essence is not a bad thing. And I'm always intrigued, this is a funny point, always intrigued when I'm sitting in the dorm in the apartment on campus and there's yet another advert for drugs. But of course the drug is sold on the basis, well, you can take this and it will help. But by the way, there are 500 side effects you might want to have. And then they go, your legs might fall off, your ears might fall off, you might die of this, you might die of that. And then it's ridiculous. But it's a market. And if you let the market look after itself, then it may well be at times the market's not looking after you.
That's a powerful statement for all of our listeners.
Yeah, it sounds like we need to get our priorities straight. Lastly, I wanted to talk about your position here at the Honors College. You started this semester. Can you tell us why you chose to come here and be an instructor and what do you teach?
Well, I think that I've taught in many places in the US, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. And often you have, for example, the Dean of the Honors College was also in Arkansas, along with another professor that I knew. And one of the professors became the Dean of a law school in San Antonio. And so I taught there for a while. And then with the Dean moving from Arkansas to Tampa, then eventually that became a useful step to try and get involved in the politics there. So what I do is I teach a bit of international relations, a bit of history of the European Union, the relationships between America and the EU and the UK. And I also throw in a bit of what's happening in the United Kingdom itself with the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Ireland Assembly. So often links matter. So I've been coming, this is my fourth time to campus. I enjoy the students. There have been lively sessions. It's a great thinking community. It's far too hot. I'm sick of hurricanes.
We agree.
Sick of hurricanes. Frightening. I mean, I don't know how you tolerate them here because I was just on the night that we had the last hurricane. I was terrified. But we survived and we move on. So if it was much colder, that would be a lot better. But on the other hand, that's never going to happen in Florida.
So, well, the heat is definitely its own problem. But what do you enjoy teaching most about honor students here?
Well, there is a liveliness, there is an interest, there's a kind of enthusiasm for what I regard as the truth and the logic of issues. And what I've been trying to do is to try and say, look, you could have a right perspective or a left perspective or different views on things, but we need to look more in life for common perspectives. Because from a common perspective, you can have a more balanced view or a more thoughtful view on whether you are right or whether you are left. That's an crude analysis of politics. So I find that here. The other staff members have been excellent. I think I've done an extra 7 or 8 classes in addition to my own classes on anything from health to tyranny and what's happening in the world. So I never profess to be a professor in the sense that I have academic excellence in something. But what I try and do is bring a different global perspective here, and I think it's something that the students enjoy.
What do you hope that students take away from your class?
Tolerance, truth, respect, understanding of others, and the fact that places that are bitterly divided on anything make no progress. And I think they have warmed to that message. They look around and see some very different messages in the politics that we've got. But you can reduce politics in a way to public service. It's about how societies are organised. And at this level, you have a choice of having a society that's levelled on a kind of hate-filled complex of 50% against 50%, or, and maybe this is a good point, in France in the 19th century, there was a person called Victor Hugo. He wrote Les Miserables. He was a poet, philosopher, politician. And he was reflecting on Napoleon Bonaparte's activities in France at that time, which he despised. And he said that, this was nationalism, a country, right or wrong. But he was a patriot. And what he said at the end of the day was he was a patriot of France, proud of it. But he also wanted to be a patriot of humanity. And if there's one thing that links the world, the 8 billion of us, we're all human. And if we can distill the best of that into a way forward, we'll win. If we continue to rip ourselves apart by focusing on difference, then we won't. And so therefore, I think when I'm here, I have 4 weeks of inspiration to be talking about those issues and hoping they have a permanent impact.
I think that kind of brings us back to the imagery that you were talking about before with Abraham Lincoln and the house divided. And I just thought that was like a very circular moment of seeing that really what we need to focus on is unity.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you could find that here in the Honors College where it's so receptive. We're so receptive to everybody's ideas.
Well, on that point, I always say to the class, that some of the great things in terms of the Renaissance, the Protestant Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, okay, they all happened in Europe. But nevertheless, it was an ability of people to want to get to an age of reason, using their minds, not their swords. And it was also an opportunity to think. And one of the great privileges you have as students and in the university is that ability to think. And I think if we do that as we move forward, then a lot of the problems that cannot be solved today will be solved tomorrow. So, hey, good place to be.
That's wonderfully said. And as much as we would love to sit with you and chat all day and pick at your brain, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity.
We're back in the studio, and we just finished talking to the Right Honorable Henry McLeish, and that conversation was incredible.
Yes.
His view on politics and global affairs is really interesting and really sheds light on what we have to do as an American nation moving forward.
I like that we didn't just talk about problems, but what solutions we should kind of be implementing in the future and just how to stay a little bit more educated and how we as young people can continue to kind of like fix a lot of the issues that we have in our society, not only in our country, but around the world. And with that said, don't forget to check the Honor Roll newsletter and our website at usf.edu/honors for all upcoming events, updates, and news. That'll do it for this week's episode. The Honor Roll podcast is recorded in the Judy Genshaft Honors College at the University of South Florida Tampa campus. Production assistance is provided by honor student Sandra Napolitano. Please join us next week where we hear more honor stories and talk to more members of the Judy Genshaft Honors College.
Until next time, go Bulls!